That morning was no different from dozens of others. The quarry awoke slowly, as if the stone itself resisted the work. At first, the silence was broken by the hum of an old generator, then by the grinding of an excavator, and finally, dust rose into the air, settling on the workers' clothes, hair, and faces. For them, it was a familiar backdrop, part of their daily routine, in which there was no room for surprise. 6 people were listed in the log: foreman Nikolai, 2 young men, Andrei and Pavel, experienced machinist Victor, and 2 auxiliary workers, the Semyonov brothers. They had known each other for a long time, worked shoulder to shoulder, and every day was like the last. The quarry was considered dangerous, but no more so than any other mine or working. There were cave-ins, equipment breakdowns, but all of this was within the normal range of risk. That day, they were supposed to deepen one of the benches, clear the area, and prepare it for drilling. The work was routine, but it required attention. Nikolai, as always, checked the task list, gave instructions, and was the first to descend. The others followed. The sun rose over the hills, casting its light on the grey walls of the quarry, turning them into giant steps. Below, the air was heavier and more humid, and every sound echoed. The workers had grown accustomed to this hum, to the way their voices seemed to dissolve into the stone. By midday, everything was going according to plan. The excavator was removing the rock, and trucks were hauling it up. The Semyonov brothers were carrying tools, and Andrei and Pavel were helping with the fasteners. Nikolai was checking to make sure no one was violating safety regulations. It looked like the day would end like dozens of others, with fatigue, sweat, and a cigarette on the side of the road. But that evening, when the drivers and dispatcher gathered upstairs, they discovered the crew hadn't returned. At first, this didn't raise any alarm. They assumed they were delayed and needed to finish the job. But time passed. The sun was setting, and the quarry remained empty. The dispatcher descended. An excavator stood on the platform, its engine running. The cabin was empty. Helmets and neatly stacked tools lay nearby. On the ground were boot prints leading to one of the abandoned tunnels, long thought closed. The tunnel was blocked by wooden beams, but one of them had shifted. It was as if someone had deliberately opened the passage. The dispatcher called out, but there was only silence in response. He returned upstairs and informed his superiors. By nightfall, the quarry was completely empty. The machines were turned off, the lights were turned off. Only the excavator continued to work until the fuel ran out. Its roar faded in the darkness, and the quarry became silent once more. The search began the next day. Police, rescuers, and even a few volunteers from the village arrived. They searched the quarry, checked every ledge, and looked into every nook and cranny. But there were no people, no bodies, no signs of a struggle, no blood. Only helmets, tools, and an open tunnel. Rumors began spreading instantly. Some said a cave-in had trapped the people. Others claimed they could have left on their own, abandoning everything. But why? Their belongings were still there. Their equipment was working. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. The settlement where the workers' families lived was in a state of alarm. Wives and children waited at the gates, hoping the men would return. But as the days passed, hope faded. Newspapers reported on the mysterious disappearance of 6. Journalists photographed the empty quarry, rusty beams and abandoned hard hats. The official version was dry. The workers could have fallen into a closed tunnel and died in a collapse. But no bodies were ever found. The tunnel was examined, but it extended deep into the rock, and the rest of the route was blocked. Rescuers didn't risk clearing the rubble. It was too dangerous. Thus began a story that transformed the quarry from an ordinary workplace into a symbol of mystery. People disappeared in broad daylight, leaving behind only the noise of machinery and emptiness. Since then, the quarry had changed. Even those who continued to work there felt the place had changed. A silence hung in the air, oppressive even more than the roar of the machines. Each new day began with the question, where had the 6 gone? And although the official reports were closed and the case gradually faded into the archives, the memory of that shift lived on. In the village it was called the last one, because after that, no one looked at the quarry the same way again. The morning after the disappearance began with an alarming call. The quarry dispatcher reported to the district headquarters that 6 workers had not returned from their shift. His voice was filled with fatigue and confusion, but not panic. In such places, they were accustomed to delays, equipment breaking down, and people staying behind to finish the job. However, within an hour, it became clear this was no delay. Down in the quarry, it was as if the workers had simply vanished. An excavator stood on the site, its cab empty. The engine was off, but the controls were still in the running position. Hard hats lay nearby, neatly stacked in a row, as if they had been removed at the same time. Tools were laid out, as if the workers were planning to return in a minute, but they were gone. Local police were the first to arrive. They descended, inspected the equipment, and walked along the ledges. Footprints led to an abandoned tunnel, officially closed 10 years ago. The beam blocking the entrance had been moved. The police peered inside. Darkness, a damp smell, drops of water falling from the ceiling, no sound. Rescuers arrived at the site by midday. They brought flashlights, ropes, and gas analyzers. They examined the tunnel entrance, but the path beyond was blocked by rocks and clay. It seemed the passage had collapsed long ago. However, the boot prints ended there. That evening, volunteers from the village arrived at the quarry. The workers' wives and relatives stood at the gate, hoping for a miracle. People chatted, reminiscing about old stories. Someone said, "In '79, 3 people disappeared too. They were never found." Another added, "I heard there's still a knocking sound underground." The search continued all night. Flashlights revealed walls, beams, and rusty rails in the darkness. The rescuers checked every corner, but found only emptiness. No blood, no scraps of clothing, no signs of a struggle. It looked as if the 6 had simply stepped into the darkness and vanished. The next day, journalists arrived at the quarry. The newspapers reported, 6 workers have disappeared without a trace. Photographers captured rusty structures, empty hard hats, and the tunnel entrance. The articles mentioned rumors of strange sounds, allegedly heard by miners back in the 1980s. Officials tried to keep a cool head. Reports read, "Probable accident. Workers could have fallen into a closed tunnel and died in a collapse." But no bodies were ever found. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the village grew increasingly tense. People discussed the disappearances on the streets, in shops, in kitchens. Some said it was a common tragedy, others that the quarry had taken them. Children whispered about ghosts of the mine. 3 days later, the search was expanded. Dogs were brought in, but the dogs behaved strangely. They approached the tunnel, began whining, and refused to go any further. Rescuers tried to force them in, but the animals resisted. This only fueled the rumors. On the 4th day, the search was called off. The report stated, "Further exploration of the tunnel is impossible due to the risk of collapse." Relatives protested, demanding that the search continue, but the authorities refused. Thus, the disappearance of the 6 became an official secret. In the village, it was called the empty shift. People continued to come to the quarry, leaving flowers at the gate, lighting candles. But there was no answer. Rumors multiplied. Some claimed the workers had found something in the tunnel and decided to hide. Others said the earth had taken them. In the evenings, around the campfires, they told stories of a rumble heard in the quarry, like thunder from deep within. The newspapers continued to write about it for a few more weeks, but then interest waned. The case was filed away. The quarry continued to operate, but not as before. Everyone who descended felt the place had changed. The silence became heavier than the hum of the machines. And although the search was officially over, it continued for the village. People waited to find at least a trace. But the years passed, and all that remained of that shift were empty helmets and an open tunnel leading into darkness. When the search concluded, silence fell over the village, but it wasn't the silence that comes with peace. It was a tense, uneasy silence, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. People returned to their daily routines, but every conversation, every encounter on the street, inevitably veered toward one topic, the disappearance of the 6. The official reports sounded dry and lifeless. Probable accident. Workers could have died as a result of a collapse, but the lack of bodies made this version a mere formality. In a small community where everyone knew each other, where every family had ties to the quarry, no one believed the simple explanation. Rumors began to multiply. Some claimed that the workers had found something valuable in the tunnel, a rare mineral deposit or once hidden contraband, and had decided to disappear. Others said they had stumbled upon an old underground passageway, leading deeper than anyone had expected, and had gone there, never returning. But there were also darker versions. Older people recalled stories from the 1970s. People had disappeared back then, they said. Almost nothing about this remained in the archives, but the memory lived on in stories. "I remember," said one former miner, "hearing a knocking sound, like someone was hitting metal from the inside. We laughed, joking that it was underground telegrams. But then one guy didn't return from his shift. They wrote him off as a cave-in, but the body was never found." These words were passed from mouth to mouth, each time becoming more ominous. In the evenings, around the campfires, teenagers told each other that the quarry was alive, that it was taking people. Someone swore they saw a light in the depths of the tunnel, although no one had ever gone down there. Others claimed to hear a rumble at night, like a distant drumbeat. Newspapers picked up the story. Words like anomaly, ghost tunnel, and cursed shift appeared in their articles. Journalists arrived, photographing the rusty beams, empty helmets, and dark entrance. Local residents were quoted in the articles, speaking of the voice of the earth. To the families of the missing, it was torment. They wanted answers, but instead received only rumors and speculation. Wives came to the quarry gates, leaving flowers and candles. Children asked, "When will Daddy be back?" And no one could answer. New legends began to emerge in the village. It was said that if you stood at the tunnel entrance at night and listened closely, you could hear footsteps. Others claimed to have seen shadows moving within. Some even said the quarry breathed. The air at the entrance would become cooler and warmer, as if an invisible current were emanating from the depths. Rumors permeated everyday life. People began avoiding work in the quarry. Those who remained did so silently, without the usual conversations and jokes. Every step down was accompanied by the feeling of being watched. A few weeks after the disappearance, the village lost power due to a power line failure. In the darkness, people began talking about coincidences again. "It's a sign," some said. "The quarry took the light, just like it took people," others added. Thus, gradually, the official version faded, and in its place, a legend grew. The quarry ceased to be simply a place of work. It became a symbol of emptiness, mystery, and fear. And the more time passed, the more the legends took root. For some, it was a story of an unfortunate accident. For others, it was a place where the earth guards its secrets and does not let go of those who stray too close to its heart. But everyone agreed on one thing. After that change, the quarry was never the same. When the official search concluded and the case was archived, it seemed the story of the 6 workers' disappearance would gradually fade from memory. But in small towns, memories live longer than reports. People continued to discuss what had happened, and each new rumor fueled interest. It was then that journalists and researchers began digging through old documents, hoping to find some kind of explanation. In the district archives, dusty folders with yellowed pages hold quarry reports from the 1970s and 1980s. At first glance, these appeared to be ordinary papers, production schedules, shift lists, safety reports. But a closer look revealed strange details. A 1976 report stated, "During the night shift, extraneous noises were recorded in the area of the western adit. The noise was rhythmic, reminiscent of thumping. The source was not identified. Work was temporarily suspended." A month later, another entry read, "The noise is recurring. Workers are complaining of floor vibrations. An equipment inspection revealed no abnormalities." These lines seemed like minor footnotes, but in the context of the disappearance of the 6, they took on a whole new weight. It seemed that decades ago, people had heard what would later be called the rumble of the quarry. Other documents were also found in the archives. In 1982, several months before the major collapse, reports stated 2 workers did not report for work. Searches were unsuccessful. They likely died in the collapse, but the bodies were never found. Official documents attributed this to the impossibility of accessing the collapsed areas. Journalists also found internal correspondence between engineers. In one letter, the site manager wrote, "Please consider installing additional equipment to record abnormal noises. Workers are refusing to descend into the western adit." The response was brief: "Do not panic. Continue work." These documents had never been officially published. They lay forgotten in folders until new disappearances began. Now, every line seemed like a harbinger. A quarry diagram found in the archives attracted particular attention. It showed a section where the tracks of the western adit led. Where the dead end should have been, there was a question mark. The engineers never explained what this meant. Perhaps the section was unfinished or not mapped. But for researchers, this presented a new mystery. Where did that route lead? And why was it marked so strangely? Newspapers published excerpts from the archives, and the story grew increasingly macabre. The disappearance of the 6 was now linked not only to signals and rumors, but also to a series of events stretching back decades. The quarry seemed more than just an abandoned facility, but a place where time looped. Disappearances, noises, signals, everything repeated itself over and over again. For the relatives of the missing, the archival discoveries were another blow. They asked, if they knew all this before, why wasn't the quarry closed completely? Why wasn't there any warning? But there were no answers. In the village, the legends only grew stronger. People now said that the quarry lived its own life, that it remembered everyone who had disappeared into it. Old people claimed to have heard the rumble in their youth, and that it always returned when disaster struck. And so the quarry acquired a new legend. It was no longer just a story about 6 workers. It was a chronicle stretching back decades to the time when that same rhythm already resounded underground. And each new document, each discovered recording, only reinforced the sense that the quarry held something more than just stone and emptiness. More than 10 years have passed since the day 6 workers disappeared into the quarry. Much has changed since then. The equipment has become obsolete. Some of the workings have been closed, and the quarry itself has gradually become a semi-abandoned facility. But the memory of that shift has never faded. In the village, people still talk about the empty day, and everyone who passed the rusty gates can't help but think of the men who never returned home. In the early 2000s, interest in history resurfaced with renewed vigor. Independent documentarians, anomaly researchers, and journalists willing to travel to the most remote places for the sake of a sensational story emerged across the country. The quarry became their ideal subject. Official reports remained silent, rumors proliferated, and legends grew ever more detailed. It was then that a group of enthusiasts decided to return to the quarry. There were 5 of them: 2 journalists from a regional newspaper, a cameraman, a geological engineer, and a former miner who had once worked at the site. They called themselves researchers, but in reality, they were a mix of professionals and amateurs, united by a single goal: to find at least some trace of the missing. The expedition began in summer. The day was hot, the sun high, and the air shimmered over the stone ledges. When they approached the gate, the locals eyed them warily. The elders shook their heads. "We shouldn't go there. The quarry doesn't like being disturbed." But the explorers were determined. Inside, everything looked as if time had stood still. Rusty beams, grass-overgrown rails, dilapidated trailers. The old excavator, rusted and covered in dust, still stood on the site. It seemed as if it was waiting for its owners, who were due back in a minute. They descended the ledges. The camera recorded every step: cracks in the walls, collapsed beams, traces of old explosions. The air was heavy, smelling of damp and iron. At the bottom, at the entrance to that very tunnel, they stopped. The beam, blocking the passage, lay to the side, just as it had 10 years ago. The engineer turned on his flashlight and peered inside first. The tunnel stretched into darkness, the walls coated in a film, and water dripped from the ceiling. They entered cautiously, using the light to illuminate the way. Every step echoed, and it seemed as if someone was following them. After a few dozen meters, they encountered a blockage. Rocks and clay completely blocked the passage, but in one spot, a crack remained between the rocks, from which a cold draft blew. The geologists said that there might be a continuation of the adit beyond the blockage. They decided to set up the equipment. They mounted the camera on a tripod and turned on the recorder to record sounds. And that's when the thing happened that so many had come here to see. A hum came from the depths. At first, faint, barely audible, then louder. It was a rhythmic sound, like metal being struck. It repeated at regular intervals, as if someone or something were tapping out a signal. The journalists exchanged glances. The cameraman, filming, his hands shaking. The former miner turned pale. "I've heard this before. Back in the 70s. We thought it was machinery, but the machinery was taken away long ago." They stood by the rubble for almost an hour, listening to the roar. Sometimes it would die down, then return again. It seemed to be coming from the depths, from the very spot where the tracks of the vanished led. When they returned to the surface, the sun was already setting. They were greeted in silence in the village. People looked at them as if they already knew what they were about to hear. The next day, newspapers published the first reports. "Quarry speaks again," the headline declared. Articles described strange sounds, a collapse, and the expedition's detection of a signal. A recording of the hum was posted online, and thousands of people listened to it. Some claimed it was ordinary interference. Others said it was the voice of the earth. Officials remained silent once again. The report stated, "No evidence of anomalies detected." But to the public, this sounded like an admission of powerlessness. In the village, the story took on a new life. People now said the quarry remembered the vanished, and that the roar was their footsteps, their voices, their presence. Children drew miners' helmets on the walls, and teenagers went to the gates at night to hear the sound. The return to the quarry yielded no answers. It only brought new questions. But it was from that moment that history ceased to be the past. It became the present again. When the expedition left the quarry, it seemed as if the place had once again fallen into its familiar silence. But this silence was different, heavy, filled with echoes of what they had heard at the rubble heap. The rumble recorded on the tape recorder was the last sound to emerge from the depths. After that, only silence. Officials quickly closed the matter. The report stated, "Further research is inadvisable." The quarry was finally declared dangerous and closed to all work. The gates were welded shut, and a no trespassing sign was posted at the entrance. But everyone understood. Restrictions would not stop those seeking answers. Life in the village went on as usual, but the memory of the missing remained. On the anniversary of their disappearance, families gathered at the gate, lit candles, and brought photographs. The children, who had grown up without fathers, now worked at other enterprises, but each of them knew their lives changed the day the quarry took 6. The rumors continued. Some said the rumble could still be heard if you approached the gate at night. Others claimed to have seen a light in the depths, even though the entrance was blocked. For some, these were mere horror stories. For others, proof that the story wasn't over. The journalists returned to the topic several more times, but each news story ended the same way. No answers. Archival documents, eyewitness accounts, expedition records, all of it formed a mosaic, but a key piece was missing. The quarry gradually became a symbol. For some, a symbol of loss. For others, a symbol of mystery. It stood on the outskirts of the village, overgrown with grass, rusty, forgotten. But everyone who passed by felt its presence. It was this presence that became the final chapter of the story. Not the found bodies, not the official reports, not the recordings of the hum, but the emptiness left behind by the people, an emptiness that oppressed more than any sound. The quarry was silent, but that silence was louder than any words, and everyone who knew this story understood. Sometimes the most terrible thing is not what we hear, but what remains unsaid.